Hey guys, Magna back here with some more tutorials. Today let's talk about using bio versus mech in TvT. And this is a tricky type of situation. TvT, like we've talked about in the past, comes down to what compositions are clashing against one another and how they can mold based upon that. So you can have bio versus bio, which degenerates into marine tank versus marine tank. You can have bio versus mech, which is what we're talking about today. And you can have mech versus mech. And this is going to be kind of part two of the four-parter, because we're going to talk about using mech versus bio and then mech versus mech. So we're getting to that point. But in all these types of situations, you need to understand how your unit composition has an advantage over the other. And the composition, or rather the advantages that you have with bio is that you have mobility and mech doesn't. So you need to be able to abuse that mobility and know when to attack into the mech army, because you're going to have to deal with it eventually. But you can't just run into a huge line of siege tanks and hellbats and whatnot, otherwise you're going to die. So let's talk a little bit about how to do that. We're going to jump into the game here, and we're going to be taking a look at Jockji versus Daishi. And I believe Jockji is the one that opens, or rather runs bio here. One of the most important distinctions between what flavor of bio you run depends on whether you want to include tanks in that or not. And if you include tanks in it, then you can kind of keep position and whatnot. But if you opt to not use tanks, then you need to really be all over the map all the time with your bio. Otherwise, it's just not going to work. If you try to engage with pure bio into an established mech army and just keep doing that over and over, then you're just not ever going to get a big advantage. So one of the best ways to kind of punish a lot of these mech openers is they will open with a Raven, and they will open with some greedy Hellion play a lot of the time. So opening up with this Reaper play is pretty smart here from Jockji, and Daishi at the same time is opening up with his own Reaper, but he's going a lot slower than Jockji is. So you can get a decent advantage from plays like this, and you'll also notice that a pretty fast command center is coming down, considering mech really does need a lot of money behind it in order to start becoming effective. So just doing a little bit of harassment here. You can see he is taking a little bit of damage too much on the Reapers here from the SCVs, but he's still doing an okay job. Killing a worker here. He's able to at least kill a few more, maybe kill the Hellion, stuff like that. But a lot of mech openers will open up, maybe with a Banshee. They'll open up with a lot of Hellions, and I've seen a lot of Blue Flame Hellion openers, so you need to be aware of that, stuff like that. But a lot of times, the biggest important inclusion is the Raven, considering they will want to land PDDs against the Marauders. So all this stuff you really need to be aware of. Somebody that's opening with a really smart mech composition won't die a lot to Banshee openers, but you can still try stuff like that. You can see a Banshee opener would have been really good in this circumstance, considering his starport is so late, and he opened up with a faster command center. But the openers aren't that big a deal. We're going to start talking a little bit more about openers after we talk mostly about how to handle the later game compositions. So you can see Jockji getting a really fast stim here. You usually won't be able to hit big stim timings in this matchup, considering they should have tanks out in time. It's kind of flimsy to assume that they won't, so I wouldn't worry too much about that, but I have seen some decent openers that involve early drops. So you can shoot for stuff like that. You can see Stim is on the way now. He opened up with Marine Shields first. The Marine Shields are really just to protect against big Hellion plays, as Stim isn't going to do that much against Hellions. And one of the bigger openers as far as opening with mech is, again, that Blue Flame Hellion opener is really similar to the play against Zerg. They'll just try to kill a lot of workers, they'll try to peel you apart with drops. The Marine Shields just help out quite a bit, considering you have that extra health against the Hellions. You can take a lot more splash shots. So that's what we're, I guess, looking at here. But Blue Flame is on the way, Raven's on the way for the mech player. You can see these are all really common things. And Jockji's going to start being a little bit aggressive once his first two medevacs come out. And that's a good window to start to shoot for, especially if you play this without tanks. And that's what we're going to see here from Jockji, is a rather tankless bio versus mech play. And we're going to be focusing mostly on how he peels Daishi apart with just constant aggression and constant multi-pronging, and tries to just stay away from his army as much as he can. So he scans up there, he sees a pretty decent composition. You can see the tank is out now. It'd be really hard to break that, so Jockji's just going to go home and wait for his medevac start to be put together. So the medevacs are in the middle of the map right now. And one thing that mech will try to do is they'll try to section everything off the best they can with turrets, because they know that their weakness is due to bio being able to be all over the map and kind of multi-prong and drop and whatnot. And it's pretty hard for them to deal with that. So they usually rely on some Vikings and a lot of turrets to try to deter drops like that, to which you either need to get in there before he can start to establish those turrets, or you can start mixing in Ravens to drop PDDs to intercept the turret shots if you wanted to really commit to drops. But I have to say, between the two styles, and that's whether you include tanks or not, not having tanks is a lot harder to use. You're going to be using a lot more Marauders, and you're going to really kind of rely on opportune moments to attack in there when the tanks are not sieged more often than not. But still, if they have a lot of Ravens and they have a lot of PDDs, then that could be to the point where your Marauders really don't do that much. So that's why trying to avoid the army as long as possible is a better play. So you can see there's a lot of dropships here, and you can see just a Doom drop is a good way to abuse a slow mech army. You can see these tanks will have to unsiege, or at least this one will. They'll have to wait for all this reinforcement to walk back here and fight this army. And if you can ever kill buildings, especially factories, it takes them a long time to rebuild. So that's kind of what Jokchi's trying to do here, is just pull them apart that way. But you do need to be willing to just not engage this army and get out of there if you can. You can see here come the PDDs down to intercept the Marauder shots. Jokchi's just trying to trade with this army though. And that's another thing that really needs to be said about Mech, is if you can get constant trades, you can see another little prong here, killing a lot of stuff from the rest of the army that Jokchi had. So getting a pretty decent advantage here in the early game as far as the worker count. He's up by 12 right now. So big drops like that and being willing to just trade your entire army out for whatever the Mech army has is a pretty good play, but you need to understand that you need to trade efficiently. This is so funny that his own tank is killing his supply depot, so he starts to repair. Okay, he got him. So yeah, being super aggressive against Mech is one good way to keep them down. It's kind of the Zerg philosophy against Mech, in the sense that if you can keep their tank count really low, then engaging them later and later in the game is going to be a good play, or rather a lot more economic. So you can see trying to do a little bit more drops here is Jokchi with this army. You'll notice another prong down here at the third base, considering it takes Mech a long time to get established and they're really going to have a hard time moving around. And also, if you can get opportunities to drop on top of tanks like this, which is exactly what Jokchi does, then that'll be a really good way to get the tanks to kind of kill each other, or at least nullify their damage output. So didn't quite get the tank, but still, and kind of losing a medevac here to the turret almost, so that's kind of silly, but still, it's really just all about multi-pronging. It's all about getting them in positions where they really can't recover too well to all your harassment. And you can see every single attack here from Jokchi has just been rally forward medevacs, load up the medevacs, and drop somewhere. And you can see Daishi's trying to get that turret ring set up that we were talking about, but he's having a really hard time doing it, and now the Mech army has to be fragmented in order to deal with this well. So maybe if he realizes this, there's only 3 tanks here and not a whole lot of buffer. If you realize that the army is all fragmented, and you can get a good engagement on like half of the army, then all of a sudden the tank count is tiny, there's not a lot of buffer here, and you might be able to plow through. So just looking out for opportunities like that, and scanning and seeing what the army size is, seeing where the position is, those are all big factors in order to peel a Mech player apart. So we can see the dropships are loading up once again. There's even another drop that's coming into the natural once again. So still just constant drops, constant harassment. That's really what dealing with Mech is all about. Now there's some tanks that are a little bit fragmented, and again, if you get an opportunity, drop right on top of the tanks. Maybe you can kill 1 or 2, maybe you can get them to trade well. It's always worth the effort. You can see there's also just a few tanks hanging out here, so he can try to press his advantage there if he realizes what's going on. Daishi starts to recover though, so Jokchi can't do too much about that right now. So a lot of stuff still rallying up here, and every single attack has been completely centered around dropping, and that's kind of the way that you win with this composition, at least if you opt to do it without tanks. If you play it with tanks, you can be a little bit more position-based, and you can force the Mech player to be a little bit hesitant about attacking out. So this is the biggest concerning part of this, is when the Terran player finally, or rather when the Mech player finally starts to be brave and get out on the map. Because if you engage into this army with the 9 siege tanks and with the Ravens, you're going to get wasted. And we've seen that a lot of times in the unit composition video. So Jokchi definitely needs to find a way to deal with this army. One way you could try to deal with it that we're seeing from Jokchi is start to switch into more Sky Terran. And that is to get out a lot of Vikings and win the air battle. And then at that point, if you can win the air battle, a couple of Banshees can clean this whole army up, assuming you're given enough time to do that. So it looks like Jokchi wants to start getting into that phase of the game where he just gets into a lot of air units and nullifies the Mech that way. But secondarily, if you can find a position where these tanks are not sieged, and you can just stim in there and fight that way, then he'll have to wait for his whole army to siege up, to which point you can probably load back up in your medevacs and just fly away, or you can just run away if you get away from there in time. But catching this army unsieged when you don't have that sky advantage is really the only way to deal with it. There's not too many other fancy ways that you can deal with it. And we're seeing Jokchi's going to get pushed around quite a bit here because this Mech army is so strong, and he can't just afford to just, YOLO it and run in there all one at a time and try to win that way. That'll be a truly you live only once, or you only live once, because you will die very fast. So again, he's got this mech army kind of out of position a little bit. The main is a tad exposed. The turret rings are up right now, and the sensor towers are up, so he knows what's going on. And Jokchi's just going to try to break this by getting a huge arc and just stimming in there and seeing what he can get done. Which is okay, especially if he's switching into more of an air dominance type of strategy. So, I mean, assuming you can get huge spreads on your army like this and you have good upgrades, where the upgrades here are really not that great for Jokchi, then you can trade okay sometimes, but this is still a really risky maneuver here from Jokchi. We'll see if this pans out. He's starting to split up just a little bit here. He's realizing there's a bit of a weakness here at the back from the mech army. He's starting to stim up and try to kill these turrets so he can get back into the main. And as he attracts some of the army, he can stim in from the other side. You'll notice about half this army wasn't here when this little attack kind of came up here. You can see he still traded kind of poorly. His unit, or rather his supply, isn't as far ahead as it was before, and he's still going to trade kind of poorly. So this is what I mean. It's a little dangerous to try and engage mech like this. But still, the switch into Sky Terran is officially begun. And if you can ever win that Sky battle, then all of a sudden the mech doesn't really matter. So all we've really seen from Jokchi so far this game is just constant drops, and then switching into an air-based composition, and hoping that he can nullify all these tanks by the tanks just not being able to really hit his army. So that's one way to deal with it. This game's going to end in the next few minutes, so we can watch the Sky transition kind of pan out, and we'll see that in just a little bit. This may actually happen quicker than we thought, because a lot of times you're going to win with the air battles, as far as killing their Vikings and Ravens and then bansheeing down the rest of his army. But sometimes you can just win the air battle and have so many Vikings that you can land right on top of the tanks and just take that trade. That's definitely possible, and I think that's what we're going to see here, considering this game is going to wrap up in that amount of time. So Vikings are coming up. You can see he's loading a lot into his dropships, so he's going to try and drop on top of the mech at the same time. So I guess his plan here is just to kill the Vikings and the Ravens so that the dropships can securely just load everything up and drop right on top of there, which is always an option once again. Or, since this army's unsieged, he could just stim in there right now, land all of his Vikings, and try to win that way. So let's see what he wants to do. The army's now sieged up. Maybe he can drop on top of it now that these Vikings are totally unchecked. I'm not sure what his plan is here. We'll have to just wait and see how it develops. Either way, nothing would really be too bad of an option here. If he dropped his entire army, and as far as these medevacs, on top of there, and landed the Vikings at the same time, he'd probably get really great trades, because a lot of these tanks would be shooting themselves. Or rather each other, so they'd be kind of killing his own army. He's just going to go for a big drop in the main right now and see if he can get this mech army to unsiege. Going for a big drop at the natural as well. The Vikings are still in the air, and they're being killed by Marines here, so that's kind of unfortunate here from Jokchi. But still, he's just multi-pronging, getting the army in 2 different positions. He kills the base up here, and does quite a bit of damage here in the main, just trying to trades out a little bit. I think he killed quite a few tanks. Now that the tanks are by themselves, he might be able to just land these Vikings, but he chooses not to right now. Or he can just reunite his forces and drop on them that way. So you can see the supplies are still favoring Jokchi by a little bit. This is still just because he's able to get decent trades because of his drops and whatnot. Now there's a Thor out. He needs to be a little bit careful with Banshee transition or something like that. But the Thors don't usually do too much. If you have PDDs against these Thors, and they will be totally useless. So you can deal with it that way. At least if they are in this type of anti-air mode. They usually won't switch. It's pretty rare to see, but anyway, so still a little bit of harassment going down. Overall, let's take a look at the workers killed. 58 worker kills, and that's purely because he's been willing to multi-prong him and drop him all over the place with this type of composition. And this, like I said, this game's going to end in just a little bit, and it's really going to come down to him either catching this army unsieged or just being willing to drop all over the army, which we've talked about in the composition videos is definitely a viable option. So let's see how this game ends. It looks like he's just going to pull them apart again. And no, never mind. So another drop here at the back of the base. Sorry, I'm going to try to slow this down a little bit. Another drop at the back of the base trying to deal a little bit more damage. Eventually he's going to have to trade out because he is maxed. You don't want to keep waiting. And by the way, notice this huge transition into extra starports. This is establishing late game TvT, and it really comes down to who has the better air army at that point. And this is Jokchi trying to get ahead in that. Notice his bank is enormous as well. So Jokchi's really playing this out quite well. So this game's going to end by the next attack. I think he just runs in there, considering there's so few tanks and they're so fanned out. And yeah, eventually if they're this worn down, you can sometimes just straight up engage. But I don't think Jokji really cares that much because he's planning a transition into a later game army anyway. It just so happens he's able to bowl this over. He starts landing his Vikings and Daishi says, yeah, GG, I'm dead. So really well played there from Jokji. And I just want to briefly take a look at the second variant of Bio versus Mech, which is mixing in tanks so that you can demand your own position with those as well. And it becomes a little bit more of a position game, but you also do have the advantage of being able to just stim in there and run in if they are ever on siege. So we're going to look at Select versus QXC. I'm going to mention we're going to see Select versus QXC quite a bit because TvTs in WCS of Season 1, which is where all these replays were from, were actually kind of rare. So I need to kind of extract as much as I can out of every single TvT that was played. So in this game, I believe Select is the Bio player, but we'll have to just double check and see. I don't quite remember. Again, I've watched so many replays, it's hard to keep all these games straight, but it looks like Select is going to go for that double Reaper opener once again. So he may very well be the Bio player, and we're seeing it springboard the exact same way we saw in the first game. So these kind of earlier Reaper builds, just to try and deal some damage to a Mech player that's opening up pretty greedy, is going to be pretty good. These are also going to be okay against Banshee openers, assuming you can transfer or transition a little bit more appropriately to deal with those Banshee transitions okay. See the command center coming down here from Select, just trying to keep the pressure on a little bit. Nothing too crazy, but we're going to have to wait and see which of these players is the Mech player. I think it's QXC, but since he's making Marauders, that would be a little bit weird. Although QXC does do stuff like that, so we'll have to see if it's actually him or not. A little bit of a drop coming up here just to try and harass. Again, we'll talk about openers a lot more in other videos. A simple Banshee opener would defend against this really easily, so this may just be a really meta play here from QXC. This isn't a very normal drop. Just defending with Marines is Select here, nothing too wild going on. You can see Select adding on a factory right now. I think that's his first factory. With these extra barracks and stim coming up, yeah, it's pretty obvious that Select is the Bio player by now. So, well, I guess we'll be watching this from Select's perspective. In the meantime, QXC adding on the extra factories. He's going to be meching, of course, considering the video is about Bio versus Mech. And we're going to have to see what Select's opts to do. He won't be as harass heavy as Jokji was in the last game. There's that Raven, by the way. The earlier Raven, just to use the PDD against Marauder shots. Also, they're really useful in a lot of other circumstances. That's what a really kind of defining characteristic of Mech is if you see this really early Raven. It can obviously lead into other things, but seeing the Raven, seeing the factories, it's very obviously Mech by this point if you're able to get a scan down on it so you know what to do. But like we talked about, Select is going to play this a little bit differently, and he's going to start adding in his own tanks so that he can kind of demand position with those as well. So the tank production is underway. He's staying on really heavy Marines. You still do want to mix Marauders into this, so you will want to get a tech lab put down, which is going down right now. Even a second tech lab. It's going to basically be Marine Marauder tank, and the tanks are really just kind of splashed in there a little bit, just so you don't lose position as easily against Mech, and so you can kind of siege them up just a little bit. Also do a lot better as far as holding off these blue flame run-bys and whatnot. So we're going to see Select start to set up here, and a lot of times with these tanks, especially against Mech, is if you can ever out-position them, that's kind of the whole reason why Mech is so strong, right? Is because if they get such great position with a lot of tanks, then it's just almost impossible to break. But if you can get maybe up here with your tanks and start hitting his production lines, then Mech has to spend a lot in order to break that. So this is one of the advantages as far as running with tanks in your composition, is if you can demand really key position, then the Mech's going to have a hell of a time breaking that, or they're going to trade really inefficiently doing so. And like we talked about in the last game, if you can ever trade effectively against Mech and kind of keep their numbers low, that's going to be one of the better ways to wear them down and kind of gain an advantage later in the game. Here's a big Doom drop here from Select, and this is going to be demanding a little bit of position with this tank here, just to try and siege his production a tad. So more Doom drops are what the Doctor ordered against this Mech play right now. So again, picking off tanks wherever you can, always going to be a good trade. The one tank in the main is going to make it really hard for him to deal with this. And as long as you're making the Mech player attack at you and you're already established with these tanks, then you should trade pretty well. You can see that QXC does eventually clean that up, but Select's still does okay. He at least thins out the tank count a little bit. I think he killed some SCVs as well. So still doing pretty well. Let's take a look at the income now. 48 to 34 in favor of Select. So those kinds of plays really, really good, especially in the early game against Mech. But now there's this big scary push coming out. And in the last game, if this was the Bio player, he would have a hell of a time holding this. And this music is so funny. It's like you can hear the army marching down to this music. But this is why tanks are important in this. And this is why mixing them in can be really good with this Bio play, because it's going to be a lot harder for QXC to establish position with this. and we're going to see this come up here in just a second. So select sieges up here, QXC starts to push up with his tanks, and as long as these tanks are here, like we talked about in the Marine tank video, it's going to be really hard for them to try and establish dominance over this when you have such good position with your tanks already. So if this were the bio player, the mech could probably just walk in there and deal a lot of damage whenever they wanted to, but it's a lot harder with the position that Select has. So another little counter drop here just to try and thin out the SCV count the best he can. This is actually forcing the mech army to go home, realizing that it won't be able to do too much. And then all of a sudden you can be the aggressor once again. You can take a third base, you can start getting in their face a little bit more. And again, if you can ever establish a really good position with this, with your tanks, then you'll be in great shape. So we're just going to have to see how this pans out. Obviously, if they're ever really low or their tanks are really spread out here, then you can just stim up there and try to just take them down that way. Select can also do this because I think he has a better upgrades right now. Yeah, it's 0-0 versus 1-1. So he can afford to just be a little bit more aggressive if he does have an upgrade lead. And I'm pretty sure this just ends the game. So if you can ever just peel off little bits of Marauders and kind of take out tanks that way, then you'll be in really great shape. And you can see once there's only a few tanks and no buffer, then the Marauders kind of just plow right through there. So yeah, the tanks mixing in offered him a lot of safety against that push. He's able to push back, and this type of style against mech really offers you a lot of flexibility. And like I was saying, this just basically ends the game. There's not a whole lot that he can do in order to hold this off. Dropping right on top of the tanks once again, gonna make you trade really, really well against that most of the time. He opts not to, but there's not a whole lot more to say about this composition here. We've kind of, seen every stage of the game. We've seen every different type of style. So let's go ahead and call that good. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. The next one will be mech versus bio. So if you are a mech player wondering what's going on, why can't I figure out this matchup, then we're going to talk a lot about what these players kind of did wrong. We will have new replays where the mech player does a lot better, and we'll address stuff like that. And we'll talk about playing mech versus bio if you are a meching player in the next TvT video, so look out for that. There are more Terran tutorials down in the description of the video, so check that out. But I'll see you guys later when I post another video. So this is very awkward. I'll see you later.